Fish only have to eat probably every 2-3 weeks, maybe in some climates every month or so, if at all in the winter. Some fish hibernate in the winter, but the biggest bass ever caught in the north was caught through the ice in Massachusetts, and it was a 15.5-pound largemouth. And that fish was like by 3 times the state record in Massachusetts. So don't discount winter fishing. Winter fishing is a time to catch big fish, and the fish have stored fat and they're heavy. They generally are different to fish for. You have to fish very slow. I can remember, and there's no reason it wouldn't work today, when everybody switched from fishing, say, soft plastics to fishing pork, and you changed to fishing a jig and a pork eel, and use very slow rolling spinner baits with big pork trailers on them in the winter. Pork is something to consider in the winter because the fish will bite on it and taste it and chew on it and hold on to it. And often they'll come up to your lure and they'll nip it and they'll expect it to move and nip it again. You'll never feel them, and they'll just swim off and leave it. So there's a lot in the winter that has to do with very slow, methodical fishing and using lures that fish will tend to hold on to better. Colors are generally not too critical. Use either black or white or a shad color. Another lure to look really strong at in the winter are jigging spoons and these little blade baits, you know, the kind that are just a gob of lead on a little stainless steel blade about that long, little minnow baits that fall, and those are very good. Vertical fishing is good in the winter because fish are on steep bluffs. You remember we talked about the fact that they have to be able to avoid the crush of a terrible cold front and then still be able to come up to feed, so they will go to steep banks. And they don't need a lot of flat territory to hunt on because they don't need that much food. So they'll be next to the steepest bluffs. And vertical fishing is a very good thing to do. And also use lighter lines because the lines get very stiff and wiry. And the wind's often blowing and it destroys your feel just blowing the heavy line. So if you can drop the lighter lines, you can use lighter weights and still fish effectively and catch more fish in the winter. Bass are sight feeders, and fish don't have eyelids, therefore they have nothing to protect their eyes from the sun. Well, that's always been the context in which people argue for cloudy weather, but the eye actually is only kept wet by the eyelid. And if you look at, say, a frog, he has an eyelid, and a tadpole, which is the same creature that metamorphosizes into a frog, doesn't have eyelids because he's in the water. So eyelids do not function in that manner. The bass has a lot of ways to control light, and when you get underwater, you'll see the difference in shade. Shade and bright light underwater are a lot different than shade and bright light, you know, topside. The shade is much deeper underwater. And on bright days, the fish can actually use the light in ways to camouflage themselves. Fish tend to be able to use cover and be deeper in cover on bright days, but there's also a lot that happens way out in open water that wouldn't happen on a cloudy day. You're going to get better schooling activity because the beam light, the interplay of light on the fish actually helps camouflage the bass if you look at them. And they can swim up on prey in deep water and still be camouflaged by this light pattern. You know, the color, underwater colors become very flat if it's cloudy, and when you have the advantage of sunlight, you can play off a flash. So I tend to use the metallic colored lures on sunny days and go to solid colors like shad and pearl and that sort of thing on cloudy days. On bright days, you can use a variety of lures that you couldn't use on cloudy days. You tend to have to specialize more. Better they can see something, the more excited they get about it. The farther away they can see your lure, the more varieties of bait fish they're going to feed on. Fish tend to be on edges, which is the predictable place for fish to be in cloudy weather. They don't tend to be as far back in cover, and they also don't tend to be as active out in open water as they are on clear days. Fish are sensitive to different things under different conditions. So there's ways that the fish are more skittish actually on cloudy days and on clear days. But for the most part, the way fishermen fish, I think that bass are less sensitive to the general approach that most fishermen take on cloudy days in terms of being skittish. It also makes certain things actually more visible. Bright colors and things stand out because the water is being flat. It's not nearly as dynamic. You know, there's so much interplay of light that's actually moving when the sun is shining, just from the ripple effect of the waves. And when the light is flat, the fish tend to not be as deep in cover. They tend to use the edges more, and they tend to be where most fishermen would think they would be and where it's actually easier to catch them in a lot of ways. And, you know, natural isn't always best on a cloudy day. Really what you want fish to do is see your lure. If they don't see it, which is the number one sense that attracts a feeding bass, fire tiger, bright yellows, chartreuses, the types of colors that you'd think would put fish off are really the kind of colors that attract them. You have to realize that a fish is actually an optimist. He comes to a lure because he wants to eat it, not because he wants to find a reason to reject it. So they're willing to ignore some of the unnatural bright colors if you just can get them to see the lure and approach it. And that's what the bright color does for you on a cloudy day. When you get a situation like wind, it can concentrate fish, and once you understand how that works, then it can be to your advantage. One thing the wind does that's not really obvious, most people say, well, it blows all the bait fish to one side of the lake or the other. What it does is it blows the drift, the plankton, which is the food chain for the bait fish, and it tends to concentrate fish really tight in very shallow water, and in some of the roughest, most turbulent water on the windward side is where you can find some of the best concentrations of fish. And I look for bait fish in order to find these fish. It's when you can throw a spinner bait up on the edge and the bait fish just scatter out of the water. You'll see that a lot on windy days. So, you know, the wind on top water, I generally change to something that makes more commotion on a windy day. I go with a popper, say, over a jerkbait. And but one of the things that's really I learned just in the last few years about the wind is, you know, casting. It's the ultimate frustration to cast in this. So most people turn around and put the wind at their back and cast and use the wind that way. And I found that my bite went up, like, just from underwater observations, seeing that fish face into the wind, my bite went way up by throwing into the wind and suffering the backlashes and retrieving downwind in the natural pattern that the bait fish actually move in. So you get more bites if you'll cast into the wind. Wind is a current, and it focuses the direction that things move, and anytime that happens, the predators are going to align with it. One suggestion I would have the guys that have a lot of trouble casting into the wind is your bite is almost as good if you'll cast crosswind. Just don't cast downwind and retrieve against the wind, because that's not the way bait moves.